Good morning, I'm Kyla McFarlane, Curator of Australian Art here at QAGOMA. Welcome to APT8 for probably your second or third day at QAGOMA over the weekend. We're here with Supercritical Mass, which is Julian Day and Jaaniste, and we're just going to have a conversation about their work for APT8, which they've done for us as part of our APT Live program. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we stand and pay respect to the elders past and present. And just to start off the conversation, it's probably worth Julian and Luke telling us what and who Supercritical Mass are and is.
I'll start that. I'm Julian of the pair of us. Supercritical Mass is an ongoing sound project whereby we gather groups of people who all use the same type of sound or sound object, and they undertake actions in public using those sound sources or sound objects. So in the case of this project, you can see among you these golden brass objects, these here, which are lightweight handbells that are each tuned very specifically. You can hear some of them ringing behind us on our video screens. And we have been encouraging groups of people to join us through series of workshops to articulate the various spaces of QAGOMA, including Maiwar Green, which you can hear later this afternoon from 3. We don't always work with bells. It's not specifically a bell project. The idea is that every time we do a project, however, it is the one type of sound source. It could be more musical objects, such as flutes. Our very first project was 80 flutes flooding the cavernous concrete bunker-like space of Carriageworks in Sydney. It could be saxophones. We did a work for Old Museum Brisbane here with about 30 or 40 saxophones within the space. But increasingly over time, it's become more and more democratic, open, everyday objects to the point where, well, the handbells are fairly democratic and open, but even more every day. So last month we did some projects using ceramic bowls, which you would scoop around on the ground of Martin Place in Sydney, creating these scraping drone tones, almost like a slow motion soccer match among the participants. And our biggest project yet was for over 1,000 people articulating simple pieces of paper within a darkened auditorium at Arts Centre Melbourne. So identical sounds, space and social groupings being the key.
And maybe just to flick back a bit, I think it's interesting to go back before Supercritical Mass for you guys, because you come from not an art-based background, but a musical background, and I think the way you met is a really interesting story to tell in the context of this work and the development of Supercritical Mass.
Hi, my name's Luke, other half of Supercritical Mass. We actually met quite a while back across the river at the Conservatorium of Music, just before it switched sides to South Bank, where it now is, as budding composition students, learning about orchestral and chamber music composition and scoring in a very traditional staged music kind of way. So that's our training, or part of our training, and that stays with us. We still are composers at various points in our practice, even today. But back then we were doing expanded music theatre projects as part of our formal studies. But Julian and I very quickly caught up a friendship where we started to explore performance art and installation-based work kind of in the dark hours of our undergraduate days. So we would walk the streets of Brisbane at about 1 or 2 a.m. and often about 200 or 300 metres apart down long roads, and stand still and look at each other and maybe occasionally move our arms, and maybe the other person would move their other arms, and we'd walk up until we were almost hugging. We might then find a whole bunch of strewn bricks on the corner, and at 4 a.m. start assembling those bricks into a kind of shape that spilled off from the footpath onto the road. These were very formative moments, which turned into various public incursions, including sliding up and down the grass along the banks of this part of South Bank. So we're always kind of interested in more than just composition, even back then, but applying the kind of the thinking around patterns and the thinking around development over time and space into something that went beyond a neat performance that happened here and audience like you are now over there. We were always wondering how it could be that the nuanced sound experiences that we were immersed in and trained in could be shared in a different way amongst other people.
And how long was it before you formed supercritical mass from that period of time? Was it a direct, trajectory, or it developed?
I think one of the reasons why supercritical mass has now been quite durable for us, because we conceived of the idea in 2007 and had our first public iteration in 2008, so it's now been, we're sort of in our 7th year of doing projects, has been because we had several try and fall off the tricycle projects beforehand. So what Luke was referring to with the early performance works in public at antisocial times of the day or night, very simple gestures, was one such project during and just out of university called Wanelli, our early performance project. That was followed by, or alongside, a kind of concept-based composer collective called Compost, which was about 5 of us composers, each of us interested in stepping outside the concert hall / recorded space of classical music and getting more and more conceptual, to the point where proto-supercritical mass events were starting to happen. And then after a bit of rethinking, we hit on this idea, and it's an open enough project, yet specific enough that it can withstand all sorts of situations and iterations, whether it's more museal and institutional or more startup, rogue events in public.
So all this comes together pretty much in the River Lounge in this space, and it's also going to be dispersed across the entire institution and building community and mass as it goes along. Maybe we should just come back, because it's such a big project, and just step through those different elements. Maybe just starting with the Federation bells, because they have a really fantastic history, and you've chosen them for particular reasons.
Yes, well, starting with these objects you're seeing next to you or in front of you, they are a collection of about 2,000, or precisely 2001 bells, commissioned 15, 16 years ago for the centenary of Federation. They're kept in the custodianship of Museum Victoria, who have very kindly loaned them to us for the duration of APT8. As distinct from normal handbells, which you may have seen in one type of performance or another, which typically have a little donger inside, and you put on white gloves and you wave them about. It's a very high-end, quite virtuosic way of using handbells. These are a little simpler on the one hand as objects and don't have any moving parts. So Luke here might demonstrate a couple of the things that happen when you articulate these bells. The standard one, of course, is just to make the classic bell tone.
And they're a harmonic set, aren't they? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can get tuned handbells in the more traditional fashion, the ones you want to then lay out very carefully on felt when you're not playing them, because they are very fragile. But typically a bell has a fairly complex sound. It's like a cluster of almost but not quite pure pitches. And these, however, have been designed so that you can create almost sine tone-like purity. So if you wanted to create a very pure, perfect fifth, you could simply pick up 2 of those bells and create that. You wouldn't get the same complex bell tower kind of sound. So,
but that's not what you were demonstrating, was it, Luke? So I'll let you continue.
Well, I think the point is you can treat them just like bells, clearly, and let them ring out. But you can invert them, you can use different parts of the donga, you can not use the donga, you can go inside the bell. They simply become, because they're so simple, they become the starting point for a generative, virtuosic engagement with them as sculptural objects that make sound.
We've been working with them for about 4 years or so and building up a relationship with the Museum of Victoria. This is the largest collection of the bells, I think, since they were commissioned back in 2001. So we're very thankful that we could bring up 300, 200 of which are displayed here. And we've done smaller projects along the way, including one in Brisbane several years ago at King George Square. They just fulfill a very beautiful sweet spot between the two other kinds of bells you could access en masse. So there's the very expensive high-end bell, but getting 200 of them is no small fortune. And you really literally do have to hold cotton gloves, and it's actually quite difficult to get the right sound. Or you can go and buy lots and lots of tiny cheap bells, but they're not so loud. These ones, anyone can hit and make quite a robust sound, so they're just perfect for taking outdoors or around a big space like QAGOMA. And we start to think of them as listening tools, so it's less about just making a bell tone, which it can do. It's more about pinging the space. So they become a way of articulating or starting a sonic event, but the sonic event doesn't end with the bell, it only begins there. It actually then pushes compressed air, literally, out into a space, bounces off walls, travels through boomy corridors, and the sonic event includes, therefore, spatial information. It includes how far away you are from other people playing those bells, how far you are away from hard and soft surfaces in the architecture. You might be able to hear it much further away or around a corner than you can see it. So the sound lines start to complicate and interweave against sight lines. So these are beautiful ways for us to kind of create a kind of active sonar almost that lots of other people can join in en masse.
And just to follow up on your point, one of the things we first noticed in what has now been a 12-month on-off engagement, getting to understand both these two locations, QAG and GOMA, is just how open these buildings are compared to many other institutions of their kind in Australia. Literally, they are more air than walls in many cases. If you look at the water room,
the water mall in
QAG, it's just a giant funnel of air with some bordering walls. And so one way of thinking about what we're doing with the dispersed performed bells and the dispersed videos is activating the airspace of the building, which is actually the dominant part if you stop looking at the walls and at the artwork on the walls.
So that's probably a good time to talk about the first part of the project, which you developed prior to APT, which was about exploring those spaces and making these video works which we see gathered behind me. And I'm realising that bringing together of those different sounds is actually operating really well here. But you've also got basically a kind of a mirror of what's up here in the River Lounge, of screens which are at site-specific spaces. So tell us about the making of this work.
We've made several dispersed video works before. We've grown up with supercritical mass being the performance event with one type of sound source, many people spread out in public. And more recently, with the contact with art galleries and design institutions, the question of how one might exhibit has turned up. How could we exhibit in a way that speaks about and shares and communicates something of the real heart of the project? So multiple videos becomes a way of producing something that not only suggests multiple angles of sight, but because video screens have their own speakers, you instantly have a multi-channel audio installation as much as video. This was the first time that we've done a site-specific version where we've come to install the video where it also was shot. So it was lovely to have that conversation that began a long time with you and the other curators here at the space about where we might position videos and how they might speak to and talk about the kind of locations that we might find. There was a few pragmatic things there, like where is a wall that can have a video stuck onto it with access to electricity that might also be viewable along a sight line. So that was a kind of almost like an algorithm or a kind of bit of research where we just walked around and discovered that, lo and behold, there are about 8 spaces where we might be able to, near a wall, locate a video that would be set up, and you'll see these kind of tunnel vision, corridor-esque shots that would record somebody actually playing a bell in that corridor, and then you can later see it. The corridors became very interesting for us because they're spaces of moving through, and they are a vista and a kind of long arc that is really about distance and reach. And so because our project is about the spatial reach of sound amongst people, it sort of seemed to be a very apt part of the architecture to work with.
Yeah, the title, This Is Not a Gallery, which is the title for this component of open plans, the bigger cluster of works. Initially, that probably meant more the very hidden, discreet, tucked away spaces that were not typically on public show. So we talked about working in the library, in the cloakroom, in the lecture theatre, and kind of revealing the innards of the building in that way. And then we went down more along this route of the egress and the pathways, which has a nice balance with the River Lounge, where they all come together, where you can see almost like a CCTV collection of these hidden videos, because this too is not typically, unless I'm wrong, not typically an exhibiting space. It feels like a transitory, come and look at the city, sit and read a book, move on downstairs, have a moment to catch your breath. But actually that's quite nice too, because you might even tend to linger in this room a little more than simply all these other points of travel. And so you travel through, catch these, and then this is a place of capturing for at least a few minutes.
Yeah, I feel like when you traverse the space in relationship to the dispersed videos, you are very much traversing and the sound follows you, and then you catch it at different times, and then things are gathered here, they're kind of bedded down here in a way. Can you talk about the performance in particular that you shot for the filming, because it's quite distinct from the workshops that you're going to build, later on as part of the live component? And maybe something about the timing of how that works in the video?
Yeah, so each video is just one participant, 8 local Brisbane people that volunteered their time for us, so thanks to them. And they are an individual, but in fact, because the videos are spaced around this reverberant room, GOMA, and big multiple room over at QAG, they are actually already a mass of 3 in QAG, 5 on that side of GOMA, and now brought to be 8 here. So there was a kind of sense that whilst they're an individual in one corridor, they're in fact a sound work that permeates throughout the corridors. And we really were trying to achieve a sense that the bell tone that you hear emanate from the video as they play and fade away with the sound fading away, might be thought of as something that pushes out through the rest of the gallery. So as much as they're a dispersed video work, they're also a dispersed sound work presented via video.
And I think it's important that they're all the one note. A big part of what we do is to use a sense of, whoops, it's one of the bell beaters discreetly falling out of my pocket. We use this idea of the homogeneous dispersed similarity as a kind of foil or counterpoint to the typical heterogeneous mix of either the real world out in the streets or in the gallery. The collection, and indeed APT, is a a riot of experiences. And we wanted to pull that right back to an even simpler idea of just this one single dispersed note, which speaks to the all working together to create one thing kind of idea of the project, but also this sense of complicating your understanding of the space. Because if nothing is differentiated in this regard, and if you're walking through several corridors and you're still hearing the exact same sound, your depth of field and your understanding of where you are in relation to other people and the other works and so forth starts to get a little bit more hazy. And I liken it to a sonic version of, say, the Gansfeld, often spoken of in, say, light and space art, James Turrell, Doug Wheeler, those kind of guys, filling a room with a particular kind of light as a form of non-differentiated information that starts to play havoc with your sense of where you are in relation to things. So this, in a sense, is inserting a sonic nothingness or non-differentiated stuff into an otherwise complex space to rethink your relationships with those things.
Which is a great segue, probably, to the workshops in a sense, because the workshops build on these concepts, but they also build in terms of the mass, of supercritical mass. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of the workshop. So maybe just take us through how they're going to progress and why they're important for the project. They're the centre of the project, really, I feel.
Yes, supercritical mass is an ongoing conversational research project, you could say. And there's two things that build as we progress from the idea of creating a mass somewhere to finally achieving it. There's building people's involvement in it, and so we open out a call out, and if you are on mailing lists and so forth with QAGOMA, should be seeing them come out from January onwards. We invite people to join in that process. Some go on the longer journey with us and come to many workshops, and we build a relationship with them, and they are very much part of the co-creation of how things evolve. And bit by bit, word gets out, they bring their colleagues, friends, other people find out about it, and that workshop group grows until the point that everyone comes together for the final performance. It's happened with the group that's going to be performing this afternoon at 3 o'clock. There was a few that tried things out with us over the last month. A dozen turned up last Monday, several dozen more turned up on the Tuesday, and all of them have not yet come together until this afternoon. The other thing that builds along with the growing community of people with us is our knowledge of what is happening acoustically, architecturally, socially, and sonically. We don't come to a project with a final piece in mind at all. We're not composers who have worked out a score and say, here you go, participants, try that. We literally are sounding out the space, testing out how things sound, how they die away, how close and far things work out, what the people already in the space, pedestrians and public, what they do, how they react perhaps to subtle and overt loud sounds. And then with the participants, what they're feeling, what they're sensing about the kind of instructions we're using, what they enjoy doing. And all of that they're active ingredients that then come together in a final instruction, which we then give people really quite late in the process, almost sometimes the hour before they perform. But because they've come to know how we work, and because our instructions hold all those active ingredients in one tiny, simple stroke, so to speak, it's very easy at that point for them to jump on and create this beautiful evolving sound field with just a sentence or two to remember.
And they're also very open workshops, because we use this phrase temporary communities. It could be quite easy in one sense to go to 5 bell ringing orchestras and say, hey, come and ring some bells. That would simply create a big spectacle of bells. But the point for us is a very open aperture for participation, and that anyone can join as long as you can hold the bell and want to be part of it. And so it's almost a study for me into how people from vastly different backgrounds, and our group this afternoon, all ages, genders, heights, cultural backgrounds, how we can find an overlapping point between all of those different pre-existing identities and backgrounds, and for a moment, for a temporary action, find an overlap point and come to some form of momentary consensus before dispersing again, as a kind of model for how we might be coexisting in this crazy heterogeneous world.
It's worth linking back to our training as composers there, because the high point of our training was the orchestra, which is a large group of people coordinated together, although it's people that have sophisticated training, expensive equipment. Expensive equipment. It's a bit more muffled now. So not everyone can be part of the orchestra. So supercritical mass is another way to bring lots of people together, where you don't have to own expensive gear or have years of training. Perhaps you only need hours or minutes of it. And therefore the question is, well, how could people very quickly coordinate and make something beautiful and subtle and nuanced, and maybe has the aesthetic integrity of a highly thought through composed piece, but can happen very quickly. And so we want to remove the follow the leader model of the conductor and the hero virtuoso, and come up with something where we're all doing the same tasks individually in our own way, but then that creates that self-organizing mass that you see in flocking birds and so forth.
Actually, I think it's probably worth expanding that idea of the mass for you, because you're building right through APT. You know, you might have 20, 40 people at each workshop, and they build, but you're keen to have people return for the closing weekend. And without any spoiler alerts, you might want to talk about what you're working up.
Yeah, we've always seen this as being in two phases, and the first phase of open plans concludes at about 4 o'clock this afternoon, once the first performance happens with our 30 to 40 participants so far. The second phase is the one that ends on the closing weekend. We have 200 bells here, and it's open to as many people as there are bells to articulate not just one part of this site, which is Maiwar Green, which you'll hear this afternoon from 3, but as much of the site as we can comfortably manage. So on one day we're looking at QAG, on another day GOMA, and through these monthly workshops that are open to you to participate in and join us, building that momentum and that growing temporary community throughout the time.
And just the final part of this installation, which we haven't yet mentioned, is the work glossary, which is on the windows facing the river lounge, which have a transparency but also a complex kind of depth that's going to build up. If you can tell us about that.
Yeah, supercritical mass always began with incredible light touch, leave nothing in the environment kind of approach, and it's almost exclusively been a verbally transmitted project. We recently had a work acquired by an institution, and suddenly the thought of how do you actually pin this thing down when you're not simply talking it out loud to your participants came up. Luke and I are trained composers, and we're used to writing things out. And so this is the first time we've really worked in this evolving, scored, drawn-out version of the project. And you're seeing the seeds of that on the windows here. These coloured diagrams to your right or your left are either our pre-thinking for this afternoon's performance, some of our thoughts about the arrangement of the bells in this space, a few theoretical ideas. We typically have a couple of our markers at the ready in our pockets when ideas flash and come to our mind. And gradually over the course of the APT, these windows will become more and more filled and more dense and complex, occasionally rubbed out and rewritten, but it's basically an evolving thought mud map, but also an instructional map as well. So you could theoretically go up and have a look at some of those diagrams and understand how to perform the work this afternoon.
These diagrams have existed for us since the beginning as conversations between Julian and I sometimes others in notebooks and journals and so forth. So this has been the first time that we've shared it publicly. So very glad to have that opportunity to show something of the way we think through the logic of the work, and that will then grow as much over the next 4.5 months as the workshops leading to the performance.
I think the kind of influence of Fluxus is important to talk about here in relation to those works, or this work.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Fluxus famously being a movement of simple, sometimes comical and whimsical, but often quite profound actions that I guess typically artists would undertake, but through the mediation of the instruction score, anyone can then take a Fluxus piece and do it. So a classic Fluxus work might be a single A4 page, or the American equivalent of the A4 page, and a typed instruction. Could be a sentence, maybe a paragraph, often a provocative statement that might not quite make sense. A big influence for me has been Lamont Young, the American composer. One of his early Fluxus works in downtown New York loft that I think he might have shared with Yoko Ono for the series of Fluxus events was to play 2 notes for as long as possible. And that for him was a simple, almost meaningless provocation in a sense. What does that mean, as long as possible? You mean like a day, a year, 600 years? For him, that then opened out an entire lifetime of exploring long tones. One of the first Western artists to really think about long notes as being the premise for a sound practice. Or it could be something really ridiculous, like have a grand piano and bring a bale of hay and wait until the piano eats it, and then when the piano's finished their meal, that's the piece over. So we sort of started with that idea at the outset of Supercritical Mass to simply have something as simple as possible that would yield enough information that complexity and questions and curiosity would emerge. And effectively that's what happens when you participate with us. You get something as simple as that. And this is a way of reflecting that more verbal or diagrammatic starting point.
And what we want to add to that kind of Fluxus singular simple instruction is the site-specific information that we research along the way. So just for one example, when we took brass players and spread them around the lake in Central Park in New York, and the audience actually were on rowboats amongst the brass players which were hidden around the shoreline, we got on a boat the day we arrived and got some trombone players to be on the bank, and we're on the phone with them asking them to try lots of things, discovering 2 very strange, striking things about that acoustic environment. The long blappy notes of the trombones sounded like very strange electronic ducks when they travelled across the flat water. And there was also a concrete bridge behind the majority of the lake which bounced back the very short, stabby brass notes. And we timed how long that echo existed for, and we really noted what notes in the trombone range worked for that still water electronic-y process. It wasn't electronic, but that's how it sounded. And so when we came to the simple singular instruction for those brass players, embedded in that simple instruction were things that we knew would work because they had already in them the expectation of a certain kind of echo and a certain kind of water-based acoustic process, which is not always apparent in the score itself, but when you articulate that particular instruction in the very particular acoustic field we've done the research in, suddenly you discover that yes, the sonic event is not just what you play, but how you play with others bouncing back in the space.
And that sense of context, even if it's as simple as a spatial context, is probably where we diverge from the classic Fluxus model, which is generally so open that you could recreate it in a concert hall or a gallery or in your living room. For us, it's always very specifically tied to an understanding of the geography of that location. It could be as simple as the acoustics, the slapback echo you get outside this building, or it could be more subtly about the social use of that space.
Thank you. I think we're out of time. I got the little signal. But I'd like to thank you both for speaking with us today and do a little bit of a promotion to say that if you check the GOMA website throughout APT that you can join the workshops and to join us on the Maywire Green or actually on the balcony this afternoon because I think that will be a great place to view it from at 3 o'clock.
We're also going to add a little bit to our scores throughout the afternoon as we brainstorm the final moments of our piece, so linger.
Great, thanks everybody.